Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today I need to make a correction to something I said in a previous video. In my response to the ontological argument, I said it'd be the last category of argument that I'd cover on this channel. But I forgot one, so today I'll set that right by covering the Transcendental Argument for God, sometimes known as TAG. I suppose I could still be forgetting more, but I hope this will wrap up my rebuttals to the common arguments I hear over and over again, and why of all the arguments I've ever heard for God, I have never found even one to be convincing. As with all the other kinds of arguments, there are a whole family of transcendental arguments, which point to various aspects of reality that couldn't be true without a god, like logic, intelligibility, and morality. A little more formally, a generic transcendental argument might say something like, Premise 1, God is the necessary precondition for logic, Premise 2, logic exists, and thus, God exists. My rebuttal to these arguments depends primarily on what exactly is meant by God. I could get on board with concluding in Spinoza's God something that isn't a willful agent in its own right, but rather is more of a personification of whatever it is that fundamentally holds together the uniformity of nature. This uniformity is an acceptable precondition because if the nature of reality were different between places or changed one moment to another, then anything understood in the here and now would be immediately misunderstood anywhere else. In other words, we can consider the dichotomy that either the laws of logic require the uniformity of nature, or they do not. If they do not, then they must be applicable to some non-uniform reality, something like the law of contradiction sometimes holds and sometimes doesn't. It wouldn't really be much of a law. Uniformity is about nature behaving in consistent patterns, and without it, there'd be no pattern to be described by any laws of nature or of logic. So we don't need to presuppose that the logic we all know and love points to a uniform reality. We can reason out the self-contradiction of believing that logic works without uniformity, and thus reason our way to the other side of the dichotomy and say that the uniformity of nature truly is a necessary precondition for logic. Under this meaning of God, there is good reason to say that the first premise holds and the conclusion follows. However, I rarely hear believers talk about God as just a metaphor for the nature of reality. Much more often, God is meant as some intelligent agent, a being who wills logic into existence or intentionally sustains intelligibility. And once again, we can set up a dichotomy. Either logic functions just fine without a god, or it requires a god to function. Either logic requires a willful agent to enact it, or it doesn't. Why must it be the first option? Why must logic require a god? What self-contradiction arises from saying that logic can exist in a godless universe? Or to put the logic example aside, what about the other transcendentals? How do we know that morality cannot be mere human opinion? How do we know that intelligibility is incompatible with naturalism? These are the points which are never fleshed out. Genuinely, I've never heard a clear answer to these questions that doesn't immediately fall back on precept. It's always something like the Bible says logic requires God, or without a God, morality would just be opinions. If anyone wants to respond to me on this point, this is my main challenge to you. How do you demonstrate that any transcendental is incompatible to atheism without referencing some assumed necessity for the divine? I suspect that many believers might try to walk me into the problem with atheism by asking me how I ground something like logic. The simple answer is that I don't know. I'm happy to say that I have evidence that logic is true, but I don't know why it is true. Perhaps it's self-grounded, or grounded in such deep and esoteric metaphysics that it is hopelessly beyond my understanding. Or maybe it's an aspect of the necessary being which needs no grounding. I don't see this as problematic because there are all sorts of times in life when we can know that something is true without understanding why it's true. Nature's justification for the event is not the same as our justification for believing in it. I can look up and know that the sky is blue, even if I don't understand enough about the physics of light in the atmosphere to say why the sky is blue. But for the sake of argument, let's say that it is problematic for me to be unable to say where logic or the uniformity of nature itself stem from, implying God is the only possible answer. Fine. But then I ask the theist, what grounds God? From whence does God come? And inevitably, I get back the same answers that I gave. Either God doesn't need a grounding, or he grounds himself, or he's grounded in a nature beyond our understanding. The most honest respondents will simply say that they don't know what grounds God. Fair enough. But then, if those answers were so problematic for me, why aren't they problematic for the believer? I'm open to correction if I'm missing something, but it all just seems like special pleading. At least with me, I don't pick an arbitrary stopping point. I don't act like I've found a problem in logic so deep that it can only be solved by God, and then shrug my shoulders when God runs into the same problem. No, I just shrug my shoulders at this supposed problem and conclude nothing definitive by it. Except the problem God runs into isn't even the same thing. It's worse. Let's start with another dichotomy. Either an intelligent agent requires intelligibility, or it can exist without intelligibility. But let's not forget that intelligibility is about whether reality and the self are capable of even having coherent thoughts at all. So if intelligibility doesn't exist, from whence come the agent's knowledge and stream of consciousness? Non-intelligibility, by definition, requires that no being could know its own thoughts or have a coherent sense of its own conscious experience. It would be self-contradictory to say that an intelligent agent exists in a non-intelligible reality, and so intelligibility must be a necessary precondition for intelligent agents. It's not that God is the necessary precondition for these transcendentals, it's that the necessary preconditions for God, if he existed, would be the transcendentals. Tag proponents get it backwards. The very existence of semi-rational, occasionally moral, mildly intelligent beings we call humans points towards their necessary preconditions. That nature must be logical and intelligible and coherent. If a perfectly rational, maximally moral, all-knowing God existed, it would point towards the same preconditions. And if this God were uncreated, uncaused, and without need for these preconditions, then why could the natural universe not have those same qualities? To be consistent, we must say that rational minds must be grounded in a logical existence, that intelligent creators must stem from an intelligible nature, and that morality is indicative of a being's ability to form opinions, but not the other way around. But the most backwards conclusion of all is when a transcendentalist rejects that we should start our reasoning from man and start with God instead. But what else can we do when we are men? Starting our reasoning from God isn't just an assumption of God's existence, it's a person using their own reasoning to conclude that some source is from God in the first place, and so it utterly fails to solve the problem that it invents. At least when I start with man, there's a legitimate version of the transcendental argument we can make, a sort of play on I think, therefore I am. If I did not exist, then there would be no being to have my conscious experience. There would be no subject to which the predicate of experiencing could apply. Thus we can say that my existence is a necessary precondition for my conscious experience, and since I do have a conscious experience, I must exist. The structure of the argument is perfectly valid, and when the work is done to justify that existence is a necessary precondition, the premises are sound. Transcendental arguments can work. But if they are ever going to work for God, they must do more than assume the first premise. They must justify why these transcendentals cannot exist except with an intelligent agent behind them. Without justification, it is just presupposition. As a methodology, presup is among the most unreliable ways to reach true conclusions. When presented with a dichotomy such as logic's necessary dependence on God or lack thereof, presup can only guess. It is a choosing of one option and an ignoring of the other that is left to chance whether it is correct. It is an utterly unreliable method and only ever sounds good if you surround yourself with echo chambers of people who make the same blind assumptions you do. So take the effort, step outside your echo chambers, and go read a fucking book.